The ballroom at Fort Bragg glowed under the heavy lights, the flags aligned in precise symmetry, the air thick with the weight of ceremony. I was 19, standing on the polished wooden stage in full dress uniform, the silver insignia on my collar trembling slightly because my chest rose and fell too fast. My name had just been called. My promotion was about to be formalized. The music from the military band had begun to soften the audience of officers, and family leaned forward, and for a fleeting second, I allowed myself to believe that I had made it, that I had escaped the suffocating shadow of Charleston and of my step family. Then the silence fractured. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jacob. He was late. He was not supposed to be anywhere near the front rows. He was my stepbrother, older, taller, heavier, the golden son my mother and my stepfather always adored. He had that same half grin he wore when he wanted to remind me that no matter what I achieved, he could still cut me down with a gesture. He moved quickly, too quickly for anyone to intervene. His polished shoes slammed against the steps, and before my body had time to understand, his foot drove straight into my stomach. There was no stumble, no warning shout. It was deliberate, brutal, and final. My knees buckled. A flash of white shot across my vision as my breath collapsed inward. The sound was muffled at first, like I was underwater, then sharp as my ears caught the ripple of gasps. The force knocked me backward. I tried to stay upright, but pain split across my abdomen, and I felt warmth spread beneath the pressed fabric of my uniform. It was red. It was real. It was the life inside me spilling out onto the stage in front of decorated officers and wide-eyed guests. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that feels like judgment, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see if I would fall completely. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the floor, the delayed punctuation to the violence. I was still clutching the small folder of vows I had written for myself. The papers scattered. My lips trembled as I tried to form words, but nothing came. I was dazed, horrified, and inside me, something irreversible had broken. The Admiral in charge of the ceremony stepped forward. Admiral Charles Donovan was not a man who wasted words. His presence filled the hall without needing to shout. Yet in that instant, his voice cut like steel through the paralysis of the crowd. "That is an assault on an officer. She is pregnant. She is losing the baby. Get him out of here now!" The command landed like thunder. The soldiers stationed for security snapped awake and surged toward Jacob. He did not run. He smirked and spat his voice carrying across the frozen guests. "She deserved it. She brought shame on all of us." His words scraped against my skin harder than the kick itself. My vision blurred as tears burned hot in my eyes, not only from pain, but from the raw humiliation of being destroyed by blood in front of the very people who were supposed to witness my achievement. I tasted iron on my tongue and realized I was biting down too hard. I tried to straighten to anchor myself, but my body betrayed me and curled inward, as if trying to protect what was already gone. Admiral Donovan raised his arm in a single sharp motion. Security dragged Jacob back even as he shouted curses. The Admiral did not flinch. His voice echoed again. "Remove him from this hall. This ceremony will not be corrupted." That was the line that split my life in two. The audience stayed silent. Some looked away, some stared with open horror, but none stepped forward. My mother sat in the second row, her hand covering her mouth, eyes wide but unmoving. My stepfather beside her clenched his jaw but did not rise. No one did. I was alone on that stage except for the Admiral and the faceless grip of security hauling Jacob out into the night. I pressed my palm against my stomach. My glove was damp. My breath came ragged. Somewhere inside me, a scream wanted to claw its way out, but I swallowed it. I would not give Jacob that victory. Instead, I forced my gaze forward. I looked straight at him as he was dragged away, his shoulders straining, his face red, his words echoing. "She is weak. She is nothing." In that moment, the truth hardened inside me. The child I carried, the future I had dared to imagine, had just been ripped from me by the very person who had spent years reminding me that I was disposable. And now he had done it in public, in front of the brass, in front of every witness who could never again pretend they did not know what he was capable of. I tried to stand tall, but the weight bent me. I heard whispers ripple through the back rows. Someone muttered about disgrace, another about scandal. The words blurred together into a fog that choked me. Yet the Admiral's voice remained sharp in my ears. "She is losing the baby." It was a declaration that turned my private grief into public fact. It ripped away any shield of secrecy. There was no hiding, no minimizing. It was brutal clarity delivered with authority, and it seared itself into me. The hall was no longer a place of honor. It was a battlefield, and I was the casualty. As medics rushed in and hands tried to steady me, I lifted my chin, despite the tears streaking down my cheeks. My breath stuttered. My arms shook, but I would not let the final image be one of surrender. I forced myself to lock eyes with the Admiral, to let him see that I was still here, that even bleeding I would not be erased. He gave a single nod, small but undeniable. Then the lights blurred and the world tilted, and I was carried out past the still silent rows of faces that had just witnessed the collapse of a family myth. For 19 years, Jacob had been the favorite, the untouchable, the heir to a name I never asked to carry. For 19 years, I had been the shadow. But on that stage, with blood seeping through silk and brass, the silence shattered, and what replaced it was the beginning of a war I could no longer avoid. Do you understand what it feels like to be betrayed by your own blood in the very moment meant to honor your sacrifice? Leave me a comment. Tell me if you have ever witnessed loyalty break in front of your eyes. Before the promotion ceremony and before the blood on the stage at Fort Bragg, there had been years of silence and years of shadows. I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, a city with wide oak trees and streets that smelled of salt from the harbor, a city tourists loved for its beauty, but I came to know for its secrets. My mother Linda had grown up there too. She had been a bright girl once, people told me, but by the time I was old enough to notice anything, she was quiet and tired, her eyes sinking into themselves like she was always apologizing for existing. When I was 7, she married Harold Miller, a retired Army officer who wore his medals like a second skin. With Harold came his son Jacob, 3 years older than me, already tall for his age, already aware that he was the center of their world. That was when the rules of my life began to take shape. At home, Jacob did not need to earn respect. He simply claimed it. Harold reinforced it at every dinner table by praising his son's smallest efforts and dismissing mine. If Jacob ran a mile, Harold said it showed discipline. If I ran 3, Harold said it was unnecessary. If Jacob shouted, Harold called it leadership. If I spoke too loudly, Harold called it insolence. My mother stayed silent in those moments, twisting her napkin in her hands, sometimes whispering that I should not make things worse. The message was clear. Harmony in the house depended on my obedience and Jacob's dominance. I remember Thanksgiving when I was 12. The table was heavy with turkey and casseroles. I reached for the mashed potatoes. Jacob spit into my plate while looking straight at me. Harold laughed. My mother flinched but said nothing. I ate in silence because not eating would have been defiance. That was the rhythm of our family. Jacob learned to test how much he could take from me, and I learned to survive by shrinking smaller. By 14, I had bruises on my arms from being shoved into door frames. Once he pushed me down the stairs. My wrist nearly snapped. The explanation given to neighbors was that I was clumsy. Harold said I had to toughen up if I wanted to matter. Jacob grinned behind him. That was the first time I realized that in that house, my pain could always be rewritten as my fault. The years blurred. In high school, I excelled academically and physically because it was the only form of rebellion left to me. I ran track-lifted weights and studied until midnight, not because anyone encouraged me, but because I wanted to prove that their version of me was not the only one. Yet every medal, every grade was met with indifference at home. Jacob, meanwhile, coasted through school, but was praised endlessly for his charm, his smile, his promise, as Harold called it. When I turned 17, I knew that staying in Charleston meant suffocating under their hierarchy forever. So I applied to the Army. I signed the papers the day after my birthday. My mother cried, but did not stop me. Harold said it was a joke that I would never last. Jacob laughed for weeks, calling me a wannabe. But when the bus pulled into Fort Bragg and I stepped off into the blistering North Carolina heat, I felt something shift. For the first time, my worth would not be defined by Harold's smirk or Jacob's ridicule. It would be measured by what I did with my own body and mind. Training was brutal, but I thrived. I outlasted men twice my size. I memorized procedures faster than the instructors expected. When others collapsed, I stayed standing. Every time I pushed through another drill, I thought about the nights in Charleston when I cried into my pillow after Jacob shoved me, and I promised myself I would never again let anyone decide that I was weak. By the end of basic, I had earned recognition. Officers noticed my endurance. Some said I had a future. For the first time, I felt pride that no one could strip away. But life does not move in clean lines. During my second year, I became close to a boy from Charleston I had known briefly before. It was reckless. It was short. He left when he realized he was not ready to commit. By then, I was already pregnant. I was 19, alone. Staring at a test in the barracks bathroom, my hands shaking, but my resolve sharper than it had ever been. I decided to keep the baby, not out of naivete, but because I wanted to give life to something unbroken, something that could exist outside the poison of the Miller household. When my family found out Jacob called me disgraceful, Harold shouted that I had humiliated the family name. My mother wept and begged me to reconsider. They treated my pregnancy not as a child, but as ammunition against me. I heard Jacob's voice on the phone one night, slurred from drink. "You will ruin everything," he said. "You are nothing but a stain." I did not respond. I saved the voicemail. I started saving all of them. That was my quiet rebellion, my silent gathering of proof. Despite their hatred, I focused on my duties. The Army recognized my achievements. I was placed on the promotion list. The ceremony at Fort Bragg was to be the culmination of every mile I had run away from Charleston. I wanted to walk onto that stage with my head high and prove to myself and to everyone who had ever doubted me that I had built something stronger than their cruelty. But Jacob could not stand the thought of it. In the days before the ceremony, he called me repeatedly. His words dripped with venom. "You are not fit to wear that uniform. That child is a disgrace." He showed up drunk at my temporary housing in Fayetteville, pounding on the door until neighbors called security. I recorded everything. My gut told me danger was coming. Yet I still believed the Army stage was different from the Miller dining table. I still believed he would not dare in front of admirals and officers. I was wrong, and the proof of that wrongness would leave me bleeding in front of everyone. When people ask about childhood, they expect stories of birthday cakes and scraped knees of laughter that echoes through warm kitchens. Mine was measured in silences in the spaces where voices should have defended me but did not. I was born into a family already divided. My mother Linda tried to create a home for me, but she chose Harold Miller, a man who carried the Army inside him long after retirement. He believed hierarchy was the only language worth speaking. With him came Jacob, his son, from a previous marriage 3 years older than me, louder than me, stronger than me, and destined to be his pride. From the beginning, the difference was obvious. If Jacob spilled juice, my mother wiped it up and Harold chuckled that boys were messy. If I did the same, Harold snapped that I was careless, and my mother whispered for me to apologize. When Jacob shouted at me, Harold called it assertiveness. When I raised my voice, Harold called it disrespect. My mother folded herself into silence between us, too afraid or too weary to break the cycle. By the time I was 10, I understood that in our house, justice was not blind. It had a favorite son. I remember one evening when I was 11. The air smelled of fried chicken and sweet tea. We sat at the dinner table in Charleston. Harold asked Jacob about his day at school. Jacob bragged about winning a playground scuffle. Harold laughed and clapped his shoulder, calling him a future soldier. Then Harold turned to me. I mentioned that I had won a spelling bee. He frowned, said words would not help me survive, and told me to clear the dishes. I obeyed. That was the rhythm. Jacob was celebrated for the simplest things. I was ignored or scolded no matter how hard I tried. The imbalance grew sharper with age. At 14, I was standing at the top of the staircase when Jacob shoved me from behind. I tumbled, hitting the steps hard, my wrist twisted beneath me. Pain screamed through my arm. Harold rushed over not to help me but to glare. He said I had to watch where I was going. Jacob smirked behind him. My mother fetched ice but said nothing to contradict Harold. I sat on the couch, cradling my swollen wrist, while Jacob sprawled across the rug, flipping channels like nothing had happened. That night, I realized my suffering could always be rewritten into clumsiness or weakness, and no one would defend me. The message settled like a stone in my chest. Thanksgiving 1 year later carved the lesson deeper. The table was set with turkey gravy and cornbread. I was hungry and reached for the mashed potatoes. Jacob leaned over and spit onto my plate, his eyes locked on mine. I froze. Harold burst out laughing. My mother dropped her fork and pressed her hands together as if praying. She whispered his name once but did not stop him. My cheeks burned with shame. I ate anyway because refusing to eat would have meant starting a conflict I knew I could not win. Jacob grinned through the entire meal. That was family. Mockery and silence wrapped in ritual. As teenagers, we were no different. Jacob grew taller, broad-shouldered with a presence that pulled attention like gravity. At school, he was popular, the kind of boy teachers excused because of his charm. At home, Harold repeated that Jacob would carry on the military legacy, that he would be the one to honor the Miller name. I existed in the margins. If I brought home straight A's, Harold shrugged. If Jacob scraped by, Harold toasted him at dinner. My mother washed dishes in silence, her face hidden in steam. Sometimes at night, I would lie awake and imagine a family where my victories mattered, where someone would notice the bruises that bloomed when Jacob shoved me against the wall, where a parent would ask why I was crying instead of telling me to be quiet. But each morning the truth returned. I was the shadow, and Jacob was the chosen. There were moments when Jacob's cruelty went further than words. Once, when I was 15, he cornered me in the backyard. The cicadas were screaming in the heat. He told me that I would never amount to anything, that I should accept being invisible. Then he shoved me into the fence so hard the wood splintered. My shoulder ached for weeks. Harold saw the mark and asked if I had tripped during track practice. I said yes because the alternative was worse. To accuse Jacob was to accuse Harold's pride, and that was not allowed. Jacob knew it. His smirk carried that knowledge every time he brushed past me in the hall. At 16, I started to push back in the only ways I could. I studied harder. I ran longer. I lifted weights until my arms trembled. Every medal I earned at school was my private rebellion, proof that I was not the weak girl they wanted me to be. Yet even when I stood on podiums, Harold never attended. My mother came once sitting in the back, clapping softly as if afraid Harold or Jacob would hear. The loneliness gnawed at me, but it also built something tougher. By 17, I was determined to escape. Charleston, with its cobblestones and magnolia blossoms, was suffocating. The house on our street, with its peeling paint and echoing silences, was a cage. When I told my mother I had enlisted in the army, she cried quietly but did not argue. Harold scoffed. Jacob laughed so hard he doubled over. They both predicted I would quit within weeks. That laughter lit a fire in me stronger than any insult. The day I boarded the bus for Fort Bragg, I promised myself that I would prove them wrong. The toxic history of my family followed me even into adulthood. When I visited Charleston during the leave, Jacob was waiting. He mocked me for wearing the uniform, said I was playing soldier. Once, he whispered that no matter how high I climbed, he could still drag me down. I believed him because I had lived under his control for too long. Still, I saved those words, tucked them into memory like ammunition. The truth was, I carried scars invisible to others. Every insult, every shove, every dinner where Harold praised Jacob and ignored me had carved grooves into my sense of self. It made me question my worth even when commanders praised me. It made me flinch when someone raised their voice. It made me feel undeserving of safety or love. But it also gave me endurance. I knew how to stand alone. I knew how to keep moving through silence. That was the paradox of a toxic family. It broke you and it built you at the same time. When people saw me at Fort Bragg, they saw a disciplined young soldier. They did not see the nights I spent staring at ceilings wondering if I would ever be more than Harold's disappointment or Jacob's punching bag. They did not see the fear that if I failed, it would prove them right. The ghosts of Charleston lived inside me whispering that I was nothing. And yet each mile I ran, each command I followed, each drill I survived, pushed those whispers back. That backstory explains why the ceremony mattered so much. It was not just a promotion. It was proof that I had escaped, that I had carved a life out of the rubble of silence and cruelty. But Jacob could never allow that. He had been trained to believe he was the center, and my success threatened the myth he lived inside. That was why he came to the ceremony with a smile twisted by alcohol and rage. That was why his foot found my stomach with precision. It was not just an attack on me. It was the final desperate act of a brother who had built his identity on my submission. And it was the last time I would ever let him define who I was. The week leading up to the promotion ceremony felt like walking across a floor made of glass. Every step looked solid, but I knew it could shatter at any moment. I had earned recognition through discipline and persistence, and Fort Bragg had become more than a post to me. It was a chance to prove that I belonged in the uniform no matter what Harold or Jacob had ever said. Yet deep inside, I sensed the storm coming. Jacob had been calling me more often. Sometimes the calls came late at night, his voice thick with liquor, each word slurred but sharp. He said I was an embarrassment. He said the Army would laugh when they learned I was carrying a child without a husband. He said the Miller name was being dragged through mud because of me. I listened in silence, holding the phone away from my ear, then pressing record. I had learned long ago that arguments with Jacob were battles I could not win. But evidence was a different kind of weapon, so I collected it. Every voicemail, every text message filled with threats. Each piece became a shield I might someday need. A few nights before the ceremony, Jacob came to Fayetteville. He showed up outside my temporary housing, pounding on the door. His words slurred together as he shouted through the wood. "You will not stand on that stage. You are not worthy of that uniform. The baby makes you weak." Neighbors opened their blinds, some called security. I did not open the door. I sat inside my hands, trembling as I held my phone to capture his voice. When the guards arrived, Jacob stumbled away, cursing. They filed a brief report. Nothing came of it. Men like him knew how to slide through cracks. But his face haunted me as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling fan turning shadows across the room. I knew he would not stop. The morning of the ceremony came bright and heavy with humidity. I dressed carefully in my pressed uniform, every button polished, every crease sharp. My stomach tightened not just from nerves, but from the life growing inside me. I paused in front of the mirror, hand resting briefly on my abdomen, whispering that today would mark the start of something new. I would prove to myself and to the world that Jacob's voice was not the final authority on who I was. Still, my hands shook as I tied my hair into regulation bun. I carried the weight of expectation on my shoulders and the shadow of dread in my chest. At the rehearsal the day before, I had walked across the stage where my name would be called. The hall was decorated with flags and rows of chairs for family and officers. I had let myself imagine applause, handshakes, congratulations. Now, as I entered the actual ceremony hall with its polished floors and solemn faces, my imagination felt fragile. I saw my mother in the second row, her hands folded, eyes darting nervously as if searching for a safe place to land. Harold sat rigid beside her, his jaw tight, his uniform jacket pressed though he had retired years ago. He carried himself as if he still commanded a room, but the sight that made my heart stumble was Jacob walking in late. He wore a suit that fit too well, a smirk stretched across his face. He looked sober, but the redness in his eyes told another story. He slid into a seat in the third row without a word. Our eyes met briefly. His stare was heavy with something I recognized from childhood. It was not just anger, it was possession. The ceremony began. The music filled the hall, voices called names. Officers walked across the stage. I kept my posture rigid, my chin high, but sweat pooled at the back of my neck. Each second stretched. When my name was called, I rose. Applause swelled. I walked forward. The insignia of promotion gleamed under the lights. My steps echoed across the stage. For a heartbeat, I felt triumph. I thought of the nights I ran under Charleston streetlights just to escape the house. I thought of the insults hurled across the dinner table. I thought of the bruises hidden under long sleeves. And I thought of how far I had come. That moment was mine. But then, movement caught my eye. Jacob stood. He brushed past an officer in the aisle, his shoulders stiff, his jaw set. People glanced at him, but no one moved to stop him. They assumed perhaps he was going to take a picture or adjust his seat. They did not know him the way I did. My pulse spiked. I wanted to shout, but the words stuck. He stepped closer, his shoes striking against the floor, each footfall a drumbeat of dread. His hand curled into a fist at his side, then unclenched. His body coiled like a spring. I knew what was coming even before it came. He lunged forward, his voice a whisper only I could hear as he leaned in. "You will not outshine me." And then his foot lifted. The next second would etch itself into my memory forever. His shoe struck my abdomen. The crowd gasped. My body folded. My breath vanished. Pain ripped through me. Blood spread under my uniform. My knees gave out. The hall fell silent. The band stopped mid-note. It was the culmination of every threat he had ever made, every smirk, every shove. He had chosen to end my triumph with violence. In that instant, the years of backstory crashed into the present. All the times I had been told to stay quiet, all the times my mother had looked away, all the times Harold had praised Jacob for cruelty, all of it led here. The ceremony became another family dinner table, only now there were dozens of witnesses who could not unsee what had happened. As I crumpled, I locked eyes with him. He did not look guilty. He looked triumphant, as if he had reclaimed the order of things. But he miscalculated. He believed silence would protect him again. He did not see the Admiral moving forward, his face carved in fury. He did not hear the order that would reverberate through every corner of that hall. Jacob had crossed a line no silence could cover. And as I lay gasping on the stage, I knew the reckoning was finally beginning. The hall stood frozen in the seconds after Jacob's foot drove into me. My body crumpled, but I forced myself not to fall completely. Pain exploded through my abdomen, sharp and searing, and my uniform darkened as the fabric absorbed what I already knew was irreversible loss. My ears rang. I could barely hear my own breath. For a long moment, no one moved. The officers in the front row stared as if their minds had not caught up with their eyes. My mother had both hands pressed over her mouth. Harold sat rigid, but his eyes glowed with something closer to contempt than concern. Jacob loomed above me, chest-heaving lips twisted into a grin that looked far too familiar. The silence cracked open when Admiral Charles Donovan stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice trained by decades of command. He did not raise it. He did not need to. His words carried like blades. "You just attacked a decorated soldier. She is pregnant. You have endangered her child. Security detain him immediately." The order rang with such clarity that every soldier in the room snapped to attention. Two men from the side aisles rushed toward Jacob. He sneered, pulling his arm back as if to resist, but the Admiral moved closer, his stare locking Jacob in place. "This hall will not be disgraced," he said. "Remove him." Jacob twisted in their grip, shouting over the silence. "She deserved it. She brought shame on all of us. She should never have worn that uniform." His words echoed against the high ceiling, ugly and desperate. No one answered. The crowd's silence was louder than any rebuttal. Officers who had once toasted Harold's career neighbors, who had once patted Jacob on the back, all of them sat rooted in their chairs, unwilling to offer him a shield. That was the first fracture. Jacob had always relied on silence to protect him. Now silence condemned him. The security detail dragged him backward. His shoes scraped across the floor. He kept shouting, calling me weak, worthless, unfit. I pushed myself upright despite the fire burning inside me. My vision blurred, but I locked my gaze on him. For the first time, I did not look away. That act felt like defiance, more powerful than any shout. Blood stained my gloves. My knees trembled, but I straightened. The Admiral stepped between us, a living wall of authority. His eyes swept the audience. "This is not a family matter," he said. "This is a crime committed against an officer in full view of witnesses." His declaration shattered any illusion that what had happened could be tucked away as a private quarrel. It was public, undeniable, stamped into official memory by the voice of a man no one dared contradict. Jacob thrashed once more, shouting that I had ruined everything. The guards tightened their hold. One of them shoved his head down as they forced him toward the exit. His voice cracked into incoherence as the heavy doors slammed behind him. The echo rolled like thunder through the hall. Then came the hollow silence, the kind that follows explosions. My chest heaved as I fought to stay conscious. Medics rushed forward, kneeling beside me, their hands efficient and steady. One asked me to lie back, but I shook my head. Not yet. Not in front of them. I wanted to show that I was still standing, even if my body was failing. The Admiral crouched briefly to my level, his voice softer but still carrying weight. "You are safe now. Let them work." I nodded once, though tears blurred my vision. As they lifted me onto a stretcher, I scanned the faces in the crowd. Some guests looked away ashamed. Others stared with wide eyes, unsure of what to do. A few whispered, but no one stood to speak. My mother finally rose, her face pale, her lips trembling, but she did not come closer. Harold remained seated, his jaw clenched, his arms crossed. Their stillness spoke louder than words. The hall was split between duty and cowardice, between the order of silence and the order of justice. As the medics carried me down the aisle, I heard the Admiral's voice again. He spoke not to me, but to the room. "This ceremony will not be forgotten for what was lost. It will be remembered for the line that was drawn." His tone was not angry. It was final, as if he were etching the moment into stone. I closed my eyes, feeling the stretcher move beneath me, the whispers ripple behind me. I knew my life had just been divided into before and after. Outside the hall, the air hit me with a rush of heat. Sirens wailed faintly as military police arrived. They took Jacob into custody formally, his wrists bound, his shouts muffled by the sound of the engines. Inside me, grief screamed, but I held it back. Not here, not now. The Admiral walked beside the stretcher until I was loaded into the ambulance. He gave a short nod, his eyes heavy with something more than duty. It felt like recognition, as if he understood that this was not just an assault, but the collapse of an entire history. The ride to the hospital blurred into fragments, the flashing lights outside the window, the medic pressing a cold compress against my stomach, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. My thoughts spiraled. I thought of the child I had carried, the future I had whispered to in the quiet of my barracks. I thought of Charleston, of the staircase, of the Thanksgiving table, of every moment. Jacob had tried to remind me I was small. And I thought of the fact that this time there had been witnesses. This time there would be no rewriting of events, no dismissal as clumsiness, no laughter from Harold. The evidence was carved into the memory of every officer in that hall. For the first time, I felt that Jacob had made a mistake bigger than me, a mistake he could not control. That realization steadied me. Even through the pain, a spark of resolve lit inside me. At the hospital, I would learn the truth I already feared, but at Fort Bragg in that hall, justice had begun not in whispers, but in the booming voice of an admiral who refused to let silence win. And as the ambulance sped forward, I clutched that thought like a lifeline. The reckoning had finally arrived. The ride to the military hospital at Fort Bragg felt endless, though the sirens cut through traffic like a blade. I lay on the stretcher, staring at the ceiling of the ambulance, while the medic pressed gauze against my stomach and asked me to stay awake. My ears still echoed with Jacob's words, "She deserved it," and with Admiral Donovan's command that had split the silence. Every bump in the road shot pain through me, but worse than the pain was the emptiness blooming inside my chest. When the doors swung open, doctors were already waiting. Fluorescent lights blurred as they wheeled me down a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Machines beeped. Voices layered on top of one another, firm and professional. I focused on the rhythm of the beeps to keep from dissolving. A nurse asked me when the pregnancy had begun. I whispered, 19 weeks. She squeezed my hand gently. Then the ultrasound confirmed what I already knew. The child was gone. The screen showed stillness where there should have been movement. My throat closed. Tears spilled silently down my face as the doctor delivered the words with practiced neutrality. "I am sorry. There is no heartbeat." My body shook, but no sound came out. The silence roared. They moved quickly to stabilize me. Blood transfusion IV drip orders passed briskly. The world narrowed to the white ceiling tiles above me. I felt like I was floating outside my own body, watching someone else lose everything. Hours later, when the procedures were finished and I lay in a dim room alone, I finally allowed the sobs to come. They tore through me silently at first, then with sound that scraped my throat raw. I pressed a pillow against my face so no one would hear. The grief was not just for the child. It was for every moment that had led here, for every dinner, where my voice was silenced, for every bruise explained away, for every time I swallowed pain, so Jacob could stand taller. Now the culmination of all those years had taken the one thing I had hoped to protect. The door opened softly. My mother stepped in. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, but her hands twisted nervously as if she were the one in trouble. She sat down in the chair beside my bed and whispered, "Please, Sophia, do not press charges. He is your brother." He was drunk. He did not mean it. I stared at her, my eyes swollen, my body weak, and wondered if she could truly believe what she was saying. A child was dead inside me because of him, and still she asked for silence. Still, she asked me to protect the family name. My voice came hoarse. "He killed my baby!" She flinched as if the word killed was too sharp for her ears. She whispered again, "Please, do not ruin what is left of us." I turned my face to the wall. I had no words left for her. A few hours later, Harold came. His uniform jacket still buttoned his posture rigid. He stood at the foot of the bed and glared at me as if I had broken some sacred code. "You humiliated this family," he said coldly. "You brought disgrace to the name, and now you want to drag Jacob through the mud. You are the one who should be ashamed." My hands clenched into fists under the blanket. I wanted to scream, but my voice was gone. His words washed over me like acid, familiar, burning, yet unsurprising. He left without touching me, without asking if I would recover. The silence he left behind was heavier than his presence. For the next day, the hospital room became a cocoon of muted noises. Nurses checked my vitals. A chaplain stopped by and offered a prayer. I nodded, though my faith in anything had evaporated. The walls hummed with machinery, but inside me there was only stillness. Visitors came and went, but the one constant was silence. The phone on the table buzzed with messages from reporters already chasing the story. I ignored them. My mother returned once more with flowers. She placed them on the table and said nothing. Her eyes begged, but her lips stayed closed. That was the pattern of my life silence masquerading as love. The Admiral came 2 days later. He stood by my bed and spoke with the gravity of someone who understood what had been lost. "The Army is investigating. Your statement will be needed." He paused, his voice softer. "What happened to you was witnessed by many. It will not be buried." His presence steadied me more than I expected. For once, an authority figure did not ask me to minimize. For once, someone called it what it was. Still, when he left the room, the silence rushed back in. Nights were the hardest. I lay awake listening to the beep of monitors, the shuffle of nurses in the hall. I pressed my hand to my stomach, now empty, and whispered apologies to the child I would never meet. I told them I had wanted to give them a life free of violence, that I had wanted to prove love could exist outside cruelty. My tears soaked the pillow. No one came to comfort me. The silence became both torment and companion. On the third day, Jacob's lawyer visited. He did not enter the room, but delivered a note through a nurse. It was from Jacob. The paper trembled in my hand as I opened it. His handwriting was sharp, aggressive. He wrote that he regretted the incident, that I had provoked him, that we both had said things we did not mean. My chest tightened. I had said nothing before his attack. It was his attempt to rewrite history yet again. I crumpled the note and threw it into the trash. The silence afterward felt cleaner, but the war inside me raged. Should I continue to endure, or should I fight? Each hour dragged me closer to a decision. The doctors cleared me to leave after a week. I walked slowly down the corridor, each step heavy but deliberate. The world outside the hospital felt too bright, too loud, but I carried the silence with me like armor. The army offered counseling. I agreed. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that silence could not be my only answer anymore. But in those early days, the aftermath felt suffocating. Every face I passed seemed to know what had happened. Some offered sympathy in whispers. Others avoided eye contact as if my pain were contagious. The silence stretched beyond the hospital, filling every room I entered. Even the air at Fort Bragg felt weighted with it. Yet underneath the silence, something else pulsed. It was faint, but it was there, a seed of defiance that whispered, "This will not be buried." This time, the truth had been witnessed. This time, Jacob could not twist it into my clumsiness or my weakness. This time, the silence could be broken. But before I found the strength to fight, I had to live through the crushing quiet. I had to learn how it felt to sit alone in a room with nothing but grief and decide that even in the absence of support, I would not disappear. That was the aftermath, the silence that followed violence, the silence that dared me to either drown or rise. The first time I walked into the Veterans Center in Fayetteville, the air felt different. It was quiet, but not the heavy silence of my hospital room. It was a quiet that hummed with possibility. The receptionist guided me to a small counseling office with soft chairs and muted lamps. That was where I met Lieutenant Carla Ruiz. She was in her 30s, strong-framed with dark eyes that seemed to see everything without judgment. She had served as a military nurse in Iraq and Afghanistan. She knew what trauma looked like, and she knew what silence could do to a person. She introduced herself simply. "Call me Carla." She waited until I was ready. For the first session, I could barely speak. My words came in fragments. "He kicked me." "The baby. My family wants me to stay quiet." Carla nodded with the patience of someone who had heard similar stories before. She told me she, too, had once been told to stay quiet. She had lived with a man who raised his hand against her and a family who told her to endure. One day, she realized endurance without action was surrender. She left. She rebuilt. She never looked back. Her voice carried no bitterness but a steel edge that made me lean forward. "Evidence is power," she said. "Do not let them rewrite your story." It was the first time someone framed my grief as something that could become strength. That night, I went back to my room and opened my phone. I listened again to Jacob's drunken voicemails. His slurred threats burned in my ears. I saved them carefully. I printed out text messages where he mocked me. I stored them in a folder labeled simply Proof. I began to see my past through a different lens. Each shove on the staircase, each insult at the dinner table, each bruise hidden under sleeves had been fragments. Now they were pieces of a larger pattern, a pattern that proved Jacob was not just cruel in a moment of anger, but consistent, deliberate, entitled. Carla helped me map those patterns. She encouraged me to keep a log. Each memory I wrote down with dates, details, and witnesses where I could remember them. At first, it hurt to relive, but slowly it became empowering. Each page said I was not crazy. I was not exaggerating. I was documenting. Carla also guided me through breathing exercises when nightmares woke me. She taught me how to ground myself when flashbacks struck. Focus on 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. I repeated the exercises until they became a lifeline. Slowly, the silence that had haunted me began to thin. Yet resistance was not only about healing, it was also about action. Carla connected me with a legal advocate who specialized in cases of military family violence. She told me that with the Admiral's eyewitness account and the medical reports, I already had a strong case. All I needed was the courage to push forward. My family did not make it easy. My mother continued calling. Each voicemail pleaded for me to forgive Jacob to keep the matter private. Harold left one message that was colder than ice. "If you press charges, you are no daughter of mine." I saved every message. I added them to the folder. Proof. At night, when loneliness pressed down on me, I opened that folder and reminded myself that silence had always been their weapon. Breaking it was mine. Carla said something that stayed with me. Trauma isolates. Resistance reconnects. She encouraged me to attend a group session with other veterans who had faced abuse. I hesitated but eventually went. Sitting in a circle with strangers, I expected to feel out of place. Instead, I felt recognized. One man spoke of being dismissed by his family after reporting harassment. A woman described her father striking her and her mother looking away. Each story echoed mine. When it was my turn, my voice trembled, but I spoke. My stepbrother attacked me at my promotion ceremony. I lost my child. My family asked me to stay quiet. The room went still. Then one woman reached out and touched my hand. "You are not alone," she said. For the first time, I believed it. Those sessions became part of my resistance. They reminded me that what happened was not a private shame, but part of a larger truth. There were others who had been silenced. There were others who were breaking free. Outside therapy, I began small acts of defiance. I stopped answering Jacob's lawyer. I stopped erasing voicemails. I stood straighter when I walked through Fort Bragg, even when whispers followed me. Each step was a declaration. I am here. I am not disappearing. Carla urged me to prepare for the storm ahead. If you choose to fight, she said, they will try to discredit you. They will say you are unstable, exaggerating, seeking attention. They always do. That is why your evidence matters. That is why your voice must be steady. I practiced with her, rehearsing what I would say when questioned. I told my story again and again until the tremor in my voice lessened, until the words became clear. My stepbrother attacked me. My family protected him. I lost my child. I will not stay silent. That clarity became my anchor. Months passed, but instead of fading, my resolve grew. The press had caught whispers of the incident. I refused interviews at first, but I kept clippings of the headlines. Female soldier attacked at ceremony. Investigation underway. Each headline was a reminder that Jacob's control was slipping. He could not bury this. Not this time. The Army's investigative board contacted me. Carla sat beside me as I gave my official statement. I described the threats, the assault, the aftermath. I submitted the voicemails and texts. I listed names of witnesses. When I finished, my voice was hoarse but strong. The officer taking notes looked at me with respect, not pity. For the first time, I felt the power shift. Jacob was no longer the only voice. Mine was finally being heard. Resistance did not erase grief. I still woke at night reaching for a child that would never be. I still felt the sting of Harold's words. I still longed for a mother who could choose me over silence. But resistance gave me a direction. It transformed pain into fuel. It told me I was not powerless. That seed of defiance that had sprouted in the hospital now grew roots. I was becoming more than a survivor. I was becoming my own advocate, my own soldier in a war against silence. The day I walked out of the Veterans Center after another session with Carla, the sky stretched wide and blue above Fayetteville. The air was heavy with summer heat, but inside me there was a flicker of something light. For years, Jacob had told me I was nothing. For years, Harold had told me I was a burden. For years, my mother had told me to be quiet. But standing there outside the center with my folder of proof under my arm, I knew a different truth. I was a soldier not only in uniform, but in spirit. I had endured the silence. Now I was ready to fight. The first time I saw the headline, it was on the front page of the Raleigh News and Observer. Female soldier attacked at promotion ceremony. Investigation underway. The letters seemed to burn into my skin. I sat at a diner near the base holding the paper with trembling hands while the smell of coffee and bacon drifted around me. Strangers read their own copies at nearby tables. They glanced at me, some with curiosity, some with pity. The story had broken free of family walls and military halls. It was now public, and nothing would ever be the same. The article laid out the basic facts. A decorated young soldier assaulted by her stepbrother during a ceremony at Fort Bragg. Witnesses shocked. An admiral calling for immediate detainment. The piece did not mention my name yet, but everyone on base knew who it was. Whispers followed me in the commissary and the mess hall, even walking across the parade ground. Some offered nods of support. Others looked away as if eye contact might entangle them in controversy. For the first time, Jacob was no longer just my private tormentor. He was a public figure of disgrace. and for the first time I realized that silence could no longer protect him. The Army's investigative board summoned me to give another statement. This time it was not just a counselor in a quiet room. It was a panel of officers' notebooks, ready eyes sharp. Carla sat beside me, steady as always. I told them everything. I described Jacob's threats, his drunken visits the night he screamed outside my door. I handed them the recordings, the texts, the crumpled note he had sent from jail. My voice wavered, but I pressed on. When I finished, the room was silent. Then one officer leaned forward. "Thank you for your courage." That was the first time the word courage had ever been tied to me by someone outside therapy. It filled me with a strange warmth, but the warmth was short-lived. The very next day, Jacob's lawyer called a press conference in Charleston. He claimed Jacob was innocent, that the so-called assault was a misunderstanding, that I had exaggerated because of emotional instability caused by pregnancy. He implied I was seeking attention. His words spread across local news stations like oil on water. Watching him twist reality stoked a rage that nearly consumed me. For a moment, I considered retreat, but then I remembered Carla's voice. Evidence is power. Do not let them rewrite your story. So when a reporter from Raleigh requested an interview, I agreed. We met in a small office near the base. The reporter was young but direct. She asked if I was ready to speak on record. My hands shook, but I nodded. I told her the truth. I told her about years of Jacob's cruelty, about my family's silence, about the ceremony and the attack. My voice cracked when I said the words "I lost my child," but I did not stop. The article ran 2 days later with my name in bold. Soldier Sophia Miller vows not to stay silent. The response was immediate. Messages flooded my inbox. Some were cruel, accusing me of dishonoring my family, accusing me of weakness. But many more were supportive. Women who had endured violence wrote to me. Veterans who had been silenced thanked me. Strangers sent prayers. For the first time, the balance tipped. The shame was not mine to carry anymore. It was Jacob's. It was Harold's. It was the silence that had enabled them. The Army issued a statement that the case would proceed to military court. That announcement felt like a line in the sand, no longer an internal family dispute, no longer whispers. It was official. Jacob panicked. From jail, he tried to send letters claiming remorse, begging for forgiveness. I returned them unopened. My mother visited again, eyes swollen from crying. She begged me to reconsider, saying prison would destroy him. I looked at her with a steadiness she had never seen in me before. He destroyed me first. She lowered her gaze and said nothing more. Harold never came. His absence was louder than his insults. As the months passed, pressure mounted. Reporters continued covering the case. Each headline pushed the story further into public light. Soldiers on base began to stop me in hallways, some offering a handshake, others a quiet thank you. I realized I was no longer only fighting for myself. I was fighting for every soldier who had been told to endure, for every daughter told to be quiet. The turning point was not just in newspapers or in courtrooms. It was in my heart. I no longer carried the weight of shame. I carried the weight of purpose. One evening, Carla asked me if I was ready for the long road ahead. I told her yes. For years, I had been Jacob's victim. Now I was becoming something else. The woman who would not let silence win. The military courtroom in Washington, D.C. felt colder than any place I had ever been. The walls were lined with flags, and the seal of the United States glared down from behind the judge's bench. Rows of uniformed officers filled the gallery. Reporters clustered near the back. The air buzzed with restrained tension. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my lawyer and with Carla just behind me. My hands were steady on the table, though inside my chest, my heart hammered like a drum. Across the room, Jacob sat with his defense attorney. He wore a suit, but arrogance clung to him like a second skin. He leaned back in his chair, smirking as if the outcome was already his. For a moment, the years collapsed. I saw the boy who shoved me down the stairs, who spit in my food, who laughed when Harold praised him for cruelty. But then I blinked and saw the man who had ended my child's heartbeat in front of witnesses. This was no longer a private family war. This was justice. The judge entered and the room rose. Proceedings began. The prosecution outlined the charges: assault causing grievous bodily harm, conduct unbecoming in a military setting, and endangerment resulting in the loss of life. Each word felt heavy, precise. Jacob's lawyer countered quickly, arguing that emotions had been high, that there was no intent, that I had exaggerated. He painted me as unstable, fragile, desperate for attention. My jaw tightened, but I kept my eyes forward. Carla squeezed my shoulder gently, reminding me to hold steady. The first witnesses were called. Officers who had been in the hall testified. They described the silence, the shock, the Admiral's command. Their voices were calm, but their words cut like glass. Then Admiral Donovan himself took the stand. The room straightened instinctively as he approached. His presence filled the space. He looked directly at the judge and spoke with the authority of decades. I witnessed the attack. It was deliberate. I gave the order for detention because what occurred was not a family squabble. It was an assault on an officer during an official ceremony. His words carried no hesitation. When Jacob's lawyer tried to suggest that perhaps Jacob had stumbled, Donovan's eyes narrowed. No. He struck her intentionally. I saw it. The gallery murmured. That moment marked a shift. The weight of silence that had protected Jacob all his life cracked. My turn came. The bailiff called my name. I rose and walked to the stand. My knees trembled, but I forced each step to be measured. I swore the oath and sat. The lawyer asked me to describe the relationship with Jacob. My throat tightened, but I spoke. I told the court about the staircase when I was 14, about Thanksgiving, about the threats before the ceremony. My voice shook at times, but each detail was clear. I described the night he stood outside my door, screaming. I played the recordings of his drunken threats, the courtroom filled with his voice snarling that I was a disgrace, that the baby made me weak, that I would never stand on that stage. The sound hung in the air like poison. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Then came the hardest part. I described the ceremony, the moment of pride, the sudden movement, the impact, the silence that followed. Tears burned my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. I said the words I had practiced with Carla. He did not just take my child. He took away the belief that family meant safety, but today I am taking it back. The courtroom was silent. Even Jacob had stopped smirking for a moment. Then his lawyer stood to cross-examine. He tried to paint me as emotional, to suggest my memory was unreliable. He asked if I had shouted at Jacob before he struck me. No, I said firmly. He asked if I had fallen by accident. No, I repeated. His tone sharpened. He asked if losing the child might have been a complication unrelated to Jacob's actions. At that moment, my lawyer stood and objected. The judge sustained. I exhaled slowly. Jacob's lawyer tried again to rattle me, but each answer was firm. Finally, he gave up. Jacob himself chose to testify. He swaggered to the stand, adjusting his tie, projecting confidence. He claimed he had tripped, that he had lost balance, that it was all a mistake. He looked at the jury with feigned innocence. She always hated me, he said. She wanted to ruin me. She wanted attention. My stomach clenched, but I kept my eyes locked on him. Then the prosecution played another recording. His voice on the voicemail saying, "You will not stand on that stage. The baby makes you weak." The gallery gasped. Jacob's face flushed. He tried to laugh it off, saying he had been drunk, saying words meant nothing. But the damage was done. His mask cracked. When the final evidence was presented, including medical testimony linking the trauma to the loss of my pregnancy, the judge called for closing arguments. The prosecution spoke with precision. They painted the picture of a man who had bullied for years, who escalated until violence stole a child's life. They reminded the jury of the Admiral's testimony, the recordings, the witnesses. They said justice required accountability. The defense tried to salvage arguing for leniency, claiming family disputes were complicated, but the words sounded hollow in the heavy room. The jury retired. Minutes stretched into hours. I sat gripping Carla's hand. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break my ribs. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words landed like thunder. I felt my knees weaken. Tears blurred my vision. Jacob cursed, slamming his fists on the table. The judge banged the gavel. "Order." Sentencing was swift. 10 years in federal prison for assault and grievous bodily harm. Additional penalties for misconduct during a military ceremony. The gavel fell again. The case was closed. Jacob shouted as guards restrained him. He called me a liar, a traitor, a destroyer of family. I stared at him not with fear, but with a quiet strength I had never felt before. I whispered under my breath, "You cannot silence me anymore." As they dragged him out, his eyes met mine one last time. For the first time in my life, I saw something in him other than arrogance. I saw fear. The courtroom emptied slowly. Reporters rushed forward, but Carla shielded me. The Admiral approached, resting a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Justice has been served," he said. "It will not erase the pain, but it will stand as truth." I nodded, unable to speak. When I stepped outside the courthouse, the sky above Washington was gray, but the air felt lighter. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. I did not answer. I walked down the steps with Carla beside me, my heart heavy but my spirit unbroken. The confrontation was over. The court had spoken. For the first time, silence had not won. When the sentence was handed down and Jacob was led away in shackles, a part of me thought relief would come immediately, that the weight pressing against my chest would lift. But healing does not happen in an instant. It comes in waves, uneven and surprising sometimes, rushing with strength, sometimes receding and leaving emptiness. In the weeks after the trial, I walked through Fort Bragg with a new awareness. Soldiers saluted me respectfully. Some nodded quietly in corridors. A few whispered words of encouragement as I passed. But I felt a growing distance from the uniform itself. Each medal, each stripe felt heavier than before. The Army had been my refuge, but now it was bound forever to the memory of a child I lost in that same uniform. When my term of service neared its end, I requested release. It was not a decision made from weakness, but from clarity. I needed space to heal without the shadow of barracks and parade grounds. Arlington, Virginia became my new home. The streets there were busy with commuters and families, but I found a small apartment near a park where the trees whispered in the wind and the sound of laughter from children reminded me of what I had lost and of what still remained possible. I decorated the walls with simple photographs of landscapes, rivers, mountains. But the centerpiece was a wooden plaque I hung above my desk. It was carved with words I had chosen carefully. "Home is not where you bleed. It is where you heal." Each time I looked at it, I felt a quiet affirmation that my story did not end in that hall at Fort Bragg. It was continuing in a different form. I joined a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting female veterans who had endured violence. My first weeks there were spent listening more than speaking. Women sat across from me with eyes shadowed by fear, by betrayal, by silence. Their voices trembled as they told me of assaults minimized, of families who turned away, of courts that failed them. I listened and I nodded, and when they asked how I understood, I shared my own story. Not in every detail, but enough that they knew I had been there. Their shoulders eased, their eyes filled with something fragile but real: trust. Slowly, I began to lead small group sessions. We sat in circles, passing tissues, passing courage. I told them that pain did not erase worth. I told them that silence was the enemy of justice. Each time I spoke, I felt the echo of Carla's words in my chest. Evidence is power. Resistance reconnects. In guiding them, I guided myself. The nightmares did not vanish. There were still nights when I woke gasping, sweat soaking my sheets, the phantom sound of Jacob's voice hissing in my ears. But instead of lying paralyzed, I rose, made tea, and wrote in my journal. I wrote letters to the child I lost. I wrote that their short life had purpose because it gave me the fire to break free. I wrote that through my work, I was ensuring other children would grow up with mothers who were safe. Each word was a thread weaving me back together. My mother appeared one morning at my apartment door. She stood trembling in the hallway, holding a paper bag of groceries, as if that offering could mend what had been broken. Her eyes were tired, her shoulders hunched. She asked softly if she could come in. Against my instinct, I let her. We sat at the table. She cried. She said she was sorry. She said she should have protected me. She said she had been afraid of Harold, afraid of Jacob, afraid of shattering the fragile shell of family. I listened quietly. When she finished, I spoke carefully. "You did not just fail me once. You failed me again and again. At the staircase, at the dinner table, at the ceremony. Forgiveness is not erasing the truth. She wept harder, asking if there was any way back. I shook my head. I told her I wished her peace, but I could not carry her guilt for her. I could only carry my own healing. She left with tears still streaking her face. Closing the door behind her, I felt sorrow, but also freedom. It was not cruelty. It was clarity. Closure does not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means drawing a line and standing firmly behind it. Months passed. The seasons shifted. Leaves blazed red and gold, then fell. Snow dusted Arlington streets. Spring bloomed with cherry blossoms. Each season marked another layer of distance from the nightmarish silence that once defined me. 1 year after the trial, I stood before a group of new veterans at the nonprofit center. I told them my full story from Charleston to Fort Bragg to Washington to Arlington. I spoke without trembling. When I finished, the room was hushed. Then one young woman raised her hand and said, "Your story makes me believe I can survive mine." In that moment, I felt the presence of my child, not as a ghost of grief, but as a spark of purpose. Their life, however brief, had propelled me into a mission larger than myself. Healing was not linear. Some days grief still clutched my throat, but each time I stood beside another woman and helped her find her voice, I felt strength. The Army had trained me in discipline, in endurance, in facing fear. Life had trained me in resilience, in resistance, in rebuilding. Now, I combined both. I became not just a survivor, but a guide. One summer afternoon, I sat on a bench in the Arlington Park watching the sun filter through branches. Children ran past laughing. My heart clenched, but then softened. I whispered into the wind, "My child, you are not meaningless. You gave me the strength to fight. You gave me the courage to help others. You live on in every voice I lift." Tears rolled down my cheeks, but they were not only of sorrow. They were of transformation. The pain had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped. It no longer defined me. It propelled me. The final step of my healing came when I was invited to speak at a veterans conference in Washington. The hall was filled with men and women in uniform advocates, lawmakers. I stood at the podium and told my story publicly for the first time. I did not speak of shame. I spoke of resilience. I spoke of the cost of silence and the power of truth. The applause that followed was not for me alone. It was for every woman who had been silenced and had found her voice again. Walking off that stage, I felt a calm certainty. I had rebuilt my life from ashes. I had transformed a tragedy into a mission. My name was no longer tied to Jacob's cruelty, but to my own resilience. That was the final justice. That was the final healing.